Just after 9:30 on the morning of the 27th of May, 1942, 60 Italian tanks charged across the Libyan desert toward a remote fortress called Bir Hakeim. The Italian crews were confident. General Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, had told them this little outpost would fall in 15 minutes. But what happened next shocked everyone. The French defenders opened up with their 75mm guns, using them like anti-tank weapons. 31 Italian tanks were destroyed in minutes. 10 more managed to push through the minefield, only to be knocked out at point-blank range. The Italian Ariete division retreated, having lost nearly half their armor. The French, they'd lost 2 men. This was Bir Hakeim, and defending it was a 32-year-old Englishwoman who'd soon lead one of the most daring escapes in World War II history. Her name was Susan Travers, and she remains the only woman ever to serve officially in the French Foreign Legion. Susan Mary Gillian Travers was born in 1909 in Kensington, London. Her father was Admiral Francis Eaton Travers of the Royal Navy, a cold, distant man who'd married an heiress for her money. The household was miserable. Susan felt ignored by both her father and her brother simply because she was female. She later described her childhood as living in a gilded cage. Privileged, yes, but trapped. She wished constantly that she'd been born a boy. Perhaps then her father might actually notice her. In 1921, when Susan was 12, the Admiral moved the family to Cannes on the French Riviera. The girl took to Mediterranean life immediately, becoming fluent in French. Her neighbor was Suzanne Lenglen, the famous tennis champion, and Susan herself became skilled enough to compete at Wimbledon as a semi-professional. Throughout the 1930s, Susan lived the life of a continental socialite. Parties across Europe, gambling at baccarat tables, multiple affairs with aristocrats. She later wrote, "Most of all, I wanted to be wicked." Athletic and tall, with long black hair and piercing blue-gray eyes, she attracted lovers, but never married. It was, by her own admission, a rather inconsequential life. But beneath the surface, she was searching for something. Purpose, maybe, or perhaps still seeking that approval from a father who'd never give it. When war broke out in September 1939, Susan was 30 years old. Her Café Society world collapsed overnight. For the first time in her life, she had a chance at real purpose. She immediately joined the Croix Rouge, the French Red Cross, as a nurse. It was a disaster. Having lived a pampered life, she had absolutely no stomach for blood or sickness. She hated every second of it. So she switched to ambulance driving, and discovered she was brilliant at it. In November 1939, Susan deployed to Finland with the French Expeditionary Force. The Finns were fighting the Winter War against Soviet invasion. Brutal stuff, temperatures well below freezing, constant artillery fire. Susan drove through it all without flinching. She served there until April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. The force retreated, and Susan escaped by ship, first to Iceland, then back to England. On the 18th of June 1940, General Charles de Gaulle broadcast his famous appeal from London. France had fallen, but the fight wasn't over. He called on French citizens to continue the resistance. Susan made her choice. She joined the Free French forces. Not because of politics or patriotism, really. She just knew she'd found something worth doing. She later wrote, "I had become the person I'd always wanted to be." Susan became an ambulance driver for the 13th Demi Brigade of the French Foreign Legion, the legendary 13th DBEL. She participated in Operation Menace, the failed Allied attack on Dakar in French West Africa. The attack didn't work, but something else did. The Legionnaires, those hardened, cynical soldiers from every corner of Europe, accepted her. They gave her a nickname that stuck for life, La Miss. It was probably the first time in her life Susan felt like she truly belonged somewhere. Through late 1940 and early 1941, Susan traveled via the Congo to North Africa, posted to Eritrea. She continued driving for senior officers, showing remarkable skill in avoiding landmines, rockets, and bullets. Her composure under fire was extraordinary. The legionnaires noticed. They respected her for it. Then came June 1941, and Operation Exporter, the Allied invasion of Syria and Lebanon to take it back from Vichy French forces. During this campaign, Susan had a brief affair with a Georgian nobleman named Colonel Dmitry Amalaklari. It didn't last, but they remained close friends. More importantly, on the 17th of June 1941, at Gaza, Susan met Colonel Marie-Pierre Kœnig, commander of the 13th Demi Brigade. French sources call it coup de foudre, love at first sight. Kœnig was married. That didn't stop either of them. Impressed by her driving ability and her courage, he appointed Susan as his personal driver. They fell in love quickly and completely. When she was hospitalized with jaundice, he wooed her with roses. They enjoyed happy months together while posted to Beirut, though military protocol and his marriage meant they could never show affection in public. He became, in her words, the love of her life. On the 14th of February 1942, the 1st Free French Brigade, including Kœnig's headquarters and the 13th DBLE, took over a defensive position at a place called Bir Hakeim. It was a remote oasis in the Libyan desert, 80 kilometers southeast of Gazala. An abandoned Ottoman fortress stood near some dried-up Roman wells. This little outpost would become the southern anchor of the Allied Gazala line, and Susan Travers was about to face her greatest test. The French position at Bir Hakeim consisted of 3,600 men, 3,000 front-line troops, 600 in the rear. General Kœnig, he'd been promoted, commanded a formidable mixed force. The 13th Demi Brigade of the Foreign Legion under Colonel Amalaklari, the 2nd Colonial Demi Brigade with battalions from Central Africa and the Pacific, and the 1st Artillery Regiment, 24 75mm guns, anti-tank guns, mortars, and 18 Bofors anti-aircraft guns. The defenders had constructed 1,200 entrenchments and gun emplacements. 50,000 mines surrounded the position in a rough pentagon covering about 2.5 by 3 miles. Not bad for a place Rommel fought would fall in 15 minutes. Rommel's Afrika Korps offensive began on the 26th of May 1942. 4 divisions attacked Bir Hakeim, the Italian 132nd Armored Division Ariete, German 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, plus elements of the 90th Light Africa Division. We already talked about how that first Italian attack went. 31 tanks destroyed, an absolute massacre. For the next 2 weeks, Bir Hakeim endured absolute hell. Temperatures reached 51 degrees Celsius, that's 124 Fahrenheit, in the shade. The Luftwaffe flew over 1,400 sorties against the tiny fortress. Susan later described the Stuka dive bombers like a vast swarm of bees droning in the distance, heading directly for us across the endless desert sky. On the 8th of June, 100 Stukas dropped 130 tons of bombs in a single afternoon raid. On the 10th, they did it again. When Kœnig ordered all women evacuated in late May, Susan initially left with a convoy, but she convinced him to let her return. She believed the Axis attack had failed. She became the only woman among 3,500 men. Fellow soldiers dug her a coffin-sized hole in the desert floor where she sheltered during bombardments. During one shelling, shrapnel tore the roof off Kœnig's Ford staff car. Susan and a Vietnamese driver immediately carried the damaged part to the field workshop and had it repaired, under fire. By the 9th of June, the situation was desperate. Ammunition nearly exhausted, only 200 rounds for the 75mm guns, 700 mortar rounds left. Water was gone. The temperature was still over 50 degrees. The position couldn't hold much longer. Kœnig decided on a desperate gamble, a mass breakout. That evening he told Susan the plan. She would drive him and Colonel Amalaklari at the head of the column. Yes, both her former and current lover in the same car. If the defenders followed her through 3 concentric rings of German positions and minefields, they might escape. If not, they'd all die. Kœnig gave her one final chance to stay behind. "There'll be no dishonor if you want to stay behind, Miss. Life in the desert is no picnic, and there'll be few opportunities for us to be together." Her response was immediate. "Wherever you go, I'll go too." The night of the 10th to 11th of June, 1942, became legendary. At 11 p.m., the column began to move. Susan at the wheel of Kœnig's Ford staff car, a beat-up, sand-scarred vehicle that had somehow survived weeks of bombardment. Behind her, 2,700 men in trucks, carriers, and on foot. Their only hope was following her taillights through the darkness. French sappers had worked through the evening to clear a narrow path through their own minefield, but the path was too narrow for what they needed to do. No choice. They had to go anyway. Susan drove in complete darkness, no headlights. Couldn't risk being seen. She followed the sappers' white tape markers through the minefield, crawling along at maybe 5 miles per hour. Her foot hovered over the accelerator. Her hands were steady on the wheel. In the back seat sat Kœnig and Amalakvari, the man she'd loved and the man she loved now. Then, about a mile out, someone hit a mine. A massive explosion lit up the desert night like daylight. German flares shot into the sky. Tracer fire erupted from every direction. Machine guns, tank guns, artillery. The Germans had discovered them. Susan floored the accelerator. The Ford leaped forward, engines screaming. She aimed straight at the German lines and just drove. "It is a delightful feeling," she later said, "going as fast as you can in the dark. My main concern was that the engine would stall." The engine didn't stall, but everything else went wrong. Mines exploded around them, some from the German field, some from their own. The Ford bounced and trashed over rocks and corpses. Tracer fire streaked past the windows. Bullets punched through the bodywork. Metal on metal. Susan kept her foot down. German tanks opened fire with their main guns. 88mm shells screamed overhead. One passed so close it sucked the air from her lungs. In the back, Kœnig and Amalakvari was shouting, though whether in fear or excitement, Susan couldn't tell. She was focused entirely on the darkness ahead, on keeping the vehicle moving forward no matter what. Behind them, the column followed. Some trucks hit mines and exploded. Some men were cut down by machine gun fire, but most kept following those tail lights, the mist leading them through hell. Susan drove for hours. At some point, she realized the brakes weren't working. The shock absorber was gone too. The Ford was literally being shot to pieces around her. She kept driving. At 10:30 a.m. on the 11th of June, 1942, Susan Travers drove General Kœnig's bullet-riddled Ford staff car through British lines near El Adab. She finally stopped the engine, looked at the car, counted 11 bullet holes in the bodywork. The shock absorber was indeed gone. The brakes were useless. How they'd made it through, she had no idea. Behind her came the rest of the column, exhausted, bloodied, but alive. Out of 3,700 men who'd held Bir Hakeim, about 2,700 made it out, including 200 wounded. The French had lost 141 dead, 229 wounded, and 814 taken prisoner during the entire siege. The Axis? They'd suffered 3,300 casualties trying to take that one little fortress, and in the end, they hadn't taken it at all. The French had simply left when they chose to. Rommel had predicted 15 minutes. It had taken 15 days, and even then, he hadn't broken them. Winston Churchill declared the Free French to be the fighting French. General Kœnig said the United Nations needed to be filled with admiration and gratitude for the defenders of Bir Hakeim. Even German officers were impressed. Friedrich von Mellenthin later wrote, "In the whole course of the Desert War, we never encountered a more heroic and well-sustained defense." For Susan Travers, She'd just led one of the great military exploits of World War II. Kœnig was promoted to general. His career advanced too far for their affair to continue. He eventually returned to his wife. Susan continued driving for him, until she was injured, when he decided to drive for once, and went over a landmine. After that, they stopped seeing each other. In May 1945, with the war in Europe over, Susan formally applied to join the French Foreign Legion. She neglected to mention her gender on the application. They accepted her. Matricule 22166, Legionnaire Susan Travers. She became the first and only woman ever to serve officially in the French Foreign Legion. She saw further service in Italy, France, Germany, and later in Vietnam during the First Indochina War. By the end of her career, she'd earned 12 military decorations from 4 nations. The Médaille Militaire, the Croix de Guerre with Palm, the Légion d'honneur, France's highest order of merit, and decorations from Britain, Algeria, and Tunisia. In 1947, Susan married Nicolas Schledelmilch, a Legion adjutant chief who'd fought beside her at Bir Hakeim. They had 2 sons, François and Thomas. The marriage ended in divorce after 13 years, but they remained friends. Susan saw Kœnig one more time in 1956, when he pinned the Médaille Militaire on her chest. All he said was, "Well done, Lemis." That was it. The love of her life reduced to 3 words and a medal. After retiring from the Legion, Susan lived quietly on the outskirts of Paris. For decades, her role at Bir Hakeim was systematically erased from official French histories. She received no recognition for the breakout, no pension despite her service. Some suggest France simply couldn't deal with the fact that a woman, and a British woman at that, had played such a crucial role in one of their proudest military moments. Susan waited. She waited until everyone else was dead. Kœnig, Émile Kvari, all the other principals. She waited until she was 90 years old. Then, in the year 2000, she published her memoir, Tomorrow to be Brave, co-written with Wendy Holden. The book became an international bestseller, translated into 8 or 9 languages. The Daily Mail called it an enthralling and epic story that reads like a Hollywood film script. At 91, Susan Travers finally got the recognition she deserved. She'd spent her entire life seeking her father's approval that never came because she'd been born female. So instead, she'd earned the respect of the French Foreign Legion, arguably the toughest military unit on earth. Not bad for a girl from Kensington who just wanted to be wicked. On the 6th of February 2024, the Conseil de Paris officially designated the Belvédère Susan Travers on the Île aux Cygnes in Paris. The memorial sits directly adjacent to the Pont de Bir Hakeim, the bridge named for her greatest military achievement. It's a fitting tribute to a woman who led 2,700 men through minefields and machine gun fire in complete darkness. A woman who earned her place in one of the world's most elite military units through sheer courage and determination. General Kœnig's final words to her say it all, really. Well done, la miss.